God, trying to decide what to cut from your cube has got to be one of the most complicated decisions you make as a cube designer. It's like you don't want to throw off the balance you've established, and what if you cut a card and it turns out to be one of the favorites of one of your regular drafters? Or what if it turns out the card only seemed bad because people hadn't evaluated it correctly and the meta just hasn't adjusted yet? I mean, Ryan, what goes through your head when you're looking at cards to cut from your cube?
He stinks, and I don't like him.
Hello and welcome to an episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony, absolutely smoked by my wife Hillary last night in Cube Maddox.
It was rough. Congratulations to Hillary. She did a great job, and yeah, nothing more to say.
I feel like I have a hard time convincing Hillary that she's good at Magic. She's very hard on herself. She's a bit of a perfectionist.
High standards.
She's got high standards, and she thinks like, oh, if I go play Magic with your friends, I'm just going to get completely smoked. And it's like, no, that's not actually true. You're like quite good at the game, believe it or not.
Yeah.
But it's a complicated game. It's really hard. Honestly, it's something I like about Magic is that it's really hard to have extremely high standards for yourself because of how complicated and deep the game is. It's like you have to accept a little bit to some degree that you're at where you're at, you know? You gotta show up and do your best.
You know, that is exactly right, and that's exactly where I was in my second match, where I just, honestly conceded after 2 games. I was just like, we're 1-1. I'm not here for game 3.
Did you win the first or the second game?
I won the first, but it was grueling, and also my opponent had to point out that I could actually win.
Oh, that's always fun.
And then they won the second game in a way that they were just looping so many things, and it was like,
Anthony, was it?
It was.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
He has like a very... I mean, we're talking about knowing where you're at. He knows where he's at. He has a very intuitive sense of like how to build decks that can just like really maximize the value of repeatable effects.
Yeah.
And he did that.
You know, it tends to be really fun doing the same thing over and over again, or better yet, having the same thing done over and over again to you.
Yeah, and I was even like, okay, well, he's looping. What's the enchantment? Seal of Doom. So I can just play my black creatures, and then he can't destroy my black creatures, and then he just had another similar effect, and it was like, okay. I'm sorry.
You go.
I'm done.
And then you walked away. Walked away to the bar. Anthony, this week on the show, we are joined by a very special guest. Someone we've been trying to get on the show for a long time, and I'm glad we finally made it work. We have Ryan Overturf on the line. Ryan, of course, is one of the, I think, arguably the most prolific Cube writer currently. Is there anybody putting more pen to paper to talk about Cube as a format than Ryan? Writer for Star City Games and a former host of the 540. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm pretty excited to be here. It's been a while since I've been on the mic, as it were.
Yeah, I hope you got a bunch of ideas that have just been building up inside of you like a pressure vessel, and we can just let it loose here on the podcast.
My constant worry doing Cube content has been that I will run out or that I'm already out of ideas. But, I don't know, they just have a way of showing up over time.
We have talked about that, too. I know, Anthony, you said when we were like 30 episodes in, you're like, well, surely that's it. Surely there's no more ideas to have. And now we're creeping up at episode 200, and it's like, are there still going to be more ideas? Who knows?
Yeah, I think when we started the podcast, I wrote down a list of maybe 8 ideas, and by episode 30, I think we had done one of them.
Yeah, how many of them have we done by now?
I don't even know. I don't know if that note even exists anymore.
You got to dig up that note. So, Ryan, we were just interested in having you on the show to talk about whatever it is you want to talk about, but your article you wrote back in January about power level outliers in Cube, I think, is a really good jumping off point for just, I think, some of the more interesting subjects that have been in your writing lately.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'll say about that article, if you have not read it, the title is mostly accurate, but it's slightly a misnomer because I wrote about approaching the concept of power level outliers, and the blurb on the website is kind of like that. But the article ends up being kind of about finding the fun, where I started with a question a lot of people ask, how do you handle power level outliers in Cube? And the answer is like, more often than not, you're thinking about it more than you need to.
Sure.
I find in my experience. But yeah, I guess that's the brief intro. I'd be happy to field whatever questions you have and encourage anybody to read the article. I always appreciate that.
Yeah, we'll definitely link all the articles in the show notes. This article and another one you published in a similar time frame, which also ended up, it was more explicitly about finding the fun, but I think these two articles feel like they are companion pieces almost, or at least coming at the same topic that's been bouncing around your head from a slightly different angle. So we'll link both those articles in the show notes, and do spend some time to read them, because, I think articles or essays are so different from, something like a podcast, because you spent time to, like, craft these arguments in very, like, careful ways that I think is really worth people's time and attention, as opposed to, a different thing, which is us kind of riffing and, talking about it here on the show, which will give you a different angle on it, but I think you really benefit from both. So definitely read those pieces if you have not already. I want to start with just what actually constitutes a power level outlier to you. And I know that this is, kind of coming sideways at this issue of finding the fun, but I do want to start there, because I think that is an approachable way to get at it for a lot of people. Because like you said, we get this question somewhat often too, people just wondering, like, how do you decide what power level outliers are in your cube? How to identify what power level outliers are in your cube? Or what even is a power level outlier? So what does that term mean to you?
And in fairness, it is a really difficult concept to approach. And part of the difficulty is trying to balance a cube, trying to get it so everything kind of has a fair shot of being good, being competitive, means you're taking a lot of different pieces and trying to say that they're of a similar power level, that they will lead to satisfying games in whatever way that they overlap, which, the system gets more complicated as you get all these variables working against each other. But the general idea as a power level outlier is just a card that when you draw it, when it does its thing, is more likely to win than the average card in the cube. And this can be informed by playing your cube. You can observe, I seem to be winning a lot when I open on turn 1 Ragavan. It can be as simple as that. And oftentimes I find it's good to be educated by what's happening in the rest of the world at Magic, to kind of pay attention to the places where people are playing far more games, albeit with different rules and deck instructions. But a card that always comes to mind immediately when I think about power level outliers is Grim Monolith.
Sure.
That card has, this is 20 years old tournament facts, but when that card was legal in Standard or whatever, it just top 8 Pro Tours at just an obscene rate, just more than any other card until Scrap Heap Scrounger, which, to be fair, is much less good in Cube, but it did end up tying that record, I believe.
I would not have guessed that Scrap Heap Scrounger would have been the next on the list there. That is a little surprising.
I think it's interesting, and I totally actually agree with you, that you're sort of defining power outliers in this very concrete way, that they are cards that win disproportionately, like we could imagine the game in hand win rate if we actually had real gameplay data. But then you move on in this article to point out that we actually don't really get that data, which is also totally true. So in a way, that definition is kind of, it is accurate, but it's not necessarily practical. So how do you sort of not justify that, but how do you actually make that definition useful to you, which I think you do in the article, but could you say more about that?
Definitely. So ultimately, you're just never going to realistically, like you said, get that data to make these super strong claims. You're just not playing enough games, and the cube's also changing constantly. So how good is your data, even if you're collecting it?
Yeah, that's a great point.
I'm trying to remember the verbiage. There's a really often quoted, really good Andrew Ellenbogen tweet where...
love that tweet.
It's competitive Magic is the exercise of extrapolating. Basically, it's your best guess from incomplete data sets. And I'm also thinking of a conversation I had with my good friend Carmen Klemperens about an album I really like. I was talking about, oh man, now I'm blanking on the artist's name. I was thinking about this album earlier today. The album's called Pony. Orville Peck. It was this Orville Peck album. It's called Pony, and it's got this kind of twangy sound to it. I really enjoy it. I'd recommend that album. And she referred to it as a vibes forward album. And that description of anything really stuck with me. So my approach to determining power level outliers is very vibes forward. If we play a game and the vibe is, that card's messed up and I'm having difficulty conceiving of it not being messed up, that's a power level outlier.
It's funny, this trying not to be too results oriented and look at, well, I won this game, therefore this card is broken, or you lost this game where you cast this card, therefore that card is bad, or whatever. It really does come up in very concrete ways. we drafted, I say we, Anthony was in a different pod last night. We had 2 cube drafts last night. Anthony was playing 1 cube. I was in a different pod, which was the first draft of a new cube designed collaboratively by some people in our play group that is intentionally like exploring a cube space that we don't actually have a lot of cubes in, which is like a vintage cube. It's got power in it. It's got some combo cards. It's like more degenerate and like, rude, for lack of a better word, than some other cubes we've played in the past.
It's hostile. There are big swingy things that you can do, right?
Yeah, and there was one player who was a couple cocktails deep, and we were giving them some gruff for passing a Mox in pack 1. They just...
Oh wait, how many cocktails deep were they?
I wasn't counting. I wasn't responsible for them, but one of the players in the group got a 3rd pick Mox Sapphire pack 1, and we were like...
That only raises further questions.
It raises a lot of questions, and it turns out that pack had 2 pieces of power in it. The first person took 1, the second person took something else, I think a fetch land or something, and then this person got a 3rd pick Mox Sapphire. And they were arguing. They were like, well, look at the games I just lost. How would I have won if I'd had a Mox? It's just a land. Like, they were honestly making the argument genuinely that you, like, hear about people making in, like, the early days of Alpha and Beta, where they were like, these cards are no good. They're just lands. Why would I bother putting them in my deck? But he was genuinely making that argument, and, the argument that you shouldn't waste a high pick on a card that is just going to be a land. And it was interesting to, like, really try and unpack the results-oriented thinking with him and be like, okay, well, here's an example of what if you went turn 1, Mox, and 1-drop, and another 1-drop, and then turn 2 you play a 3-drop. Like, that's a game you win. He's like, well, how many games is that going to happen? And it's like, well, you can say that about any card. It was really just, I had not had that kind of, and he's a player that is like pretty experienced, but only plays retail limited, right? Like, has never played an online cube, has never played with power before, like, really kind of only knows Magic in this one context. And it was really interesting hearing a player that is like a reasonably enfranchised player be like, I think these cards are bad, and trying to explain to him why it actually is not the case. It was just fascinating.
The conversation gets difficult, too, when you try to hone in on a specific thing that happens in a draft, right? Because you're thinking, I would pick that Mox, and then I would also draft with other heuristics that I've gained over decades of playing formats like this. It's not just like I would have the Mox and my deck would be otherwise the same. Be like,
exactly,
I would probably draft a deck where the Mox is good,
Yeah. I think that a lot of people fall into that kind of results-oriented thinking. And this was the very first draft of this cube, and there were people saying, like, oh, well, I lost every time this card was cast. And it's like, I think helpfully the cube curators were like, this is the first draft. This is all helpful, but definitely not going to be making any decisions based on the results, like the record of this draft, which I think is the right way to go.
Yeah, and you also have to consider not just the games played, but the shapes of games that could be played. I mentioned Ragavan, and I know that it's a card I've heard you talk about, Andy, in the context where, like, people talk about this card as being messed up, and it's like, is it really that good? And I'm of a similar mind. Like, people are just unreasonable about this card in Constructed. It's like pretty fine, all things considered, in Modern. And the thing is, if you have it turn 1 on the play in Cube, you win a lot of those games. Like, you win those games disproportionately. But when you draw that card on turn 6, it's not that different from Jackal Pup. And nobody talks about those games. The people that hate that card in Modern never talk about, like, turn 4. That's just not on their radar. But you have to consider, like, all right, so this is what the games look like when this card shows up on turn 1. This is what the games look like when my opponent plays Sprout Swarm, And then it's kind of an aggregation of how bad are the games where Ragavan wins easily, and are the other games, do they actually make up for that in any meaningful way?
Yeah, I mean, that almost reminds me of something else that you brought up in one of your articles when you're talking about sort of repetitive gameplay and how, take a card like Recurring Nightmare, it might not be super powerful in a given cube, but the games where it's really good, the game is going to be all about that Recurring Nightmare. And I wonder if that is sort of a similar emotional experience to cards like Ragavan, where if somebody plays a turn 1 Ragavan across multiple games, it has that same sort of repetitive feel, and you're just not going to notice the games when somebody draws it on turn 7 and it doesn't really do anything. So it's really just about that perception of the kinds of games it's creating.
Yeah, and the people that hate it just kind of turn off They don't listen. You know, when you get to the point in the game where they've got their planeswalkers, let's be real, it's the blue-white control players that hate Ragavan the most. You know, they got their stupid little wall of omens and they're activating with their fairies. And you're
Wow,
like, God,
Wall of Omens called out.
it's really bad if I draw Ragavan here and they just roll their eyes at you. And like, it's literally true. It's a horrible card to draw here.
Yeah, I think Ragavan is one of those ones, too, that I think maybe my suggesting that it's not as overhyped as a lot of people think it is also really informed by my specific cube, where I have like 100 removal spells. Like, that's not even much of an exaggeration. So many of them are 1 mana. I really like the sort of small tempo-based removal that can't remove anything unconditionally, but can remove small stuff. And so in my cube, it's like very likely that you play it on turn 1 and your opponent, the chances they don't have a blocker or a removal spell for it are extremely low in most contexts. And if they do have a blocker and you can follow up Ragavan with a removal spell, then, you know, that's a little more work you've done to actually get the payoff. So it's like, it's so specific to that particular meta where, you know, a Mother of Runes is another card that I talk about in this light, where in my cube, it's honestly been totally fine. It's nice to have a 1-drop that kind of demands immediate answers, right? That changes the texture of the game as opposed to saying, well, there's a 1-drop, I can ignore it for a while. That, like Ragavan says, answer is immediately or it's going to become a problem. But most decks can, most of the time, is what ends up happening. But I've played Mother of Runes in cubes where that's not the case, where you have a third of the removal spells that I have in my cube, and my heuristics are all wrong, and all of a sudden I'm like, wait, this card is just so bad because, or so good rather, but so bad for the vibes, because if you don't have that one removal spell at that one time, the chances you're going to be able to, you know, double up on removal spells later on in a turn are that much lower because there's just lower density of removal. So a lot of these things really come down to context, and that's something else I think, you know, you mentioned that players don't like to listen when you start talking about the context of the game that they're not focused on, right? Like, if they're focused on the times when it's good and you want to bring up times when it's bad, they're putting earmuffs on. I think the same goes for people that you try to explain that it's all about context, and they're like, no, this card's just good. It's just good all the time, or it's just bad all the time, or whatever.
And I think that Mother of Runes is a really good example in the kind of same sphere as Ragavan, where you mentioned 1 mana removal. That's going to be essential for any cube that's trying to make Mother of Runes reasonable. But when I think about, like, making Ragavan kind of bad, the card that immediately comes to mind is Young Wolf. Like, if you just have, like, a really good blocker, then you just turn that card off really easily.
Yeah. There's lots of ways, I think, to make any of these cards, you know, good or bad. And that comes right back to this concept of power outliers, right? Like, you absolutely can have a cube where Ragavan is not a power outlier, and it's not that radical to imagine how you make a cube that's like that. The answer is a lot of good 1 and 2 mana blockers, like you said, and throw some 1 mana removal in there and make the games all about this card advantage going along thing, and all of a sudden the best 1-drop in the world is not that great anymore.
Yeah, and we're not even getting to people that have all kinds of house rules implemented in their cubes, right? That's a space that's really exploded recently, but you take something like a Cascade cube is one I hear about all the time, where every spell just gets Cascade. You start with like an emblem where that's now the rule of the game that you play. And when I think about like really historically powerful cards, they do more than attacking and blocking.
Yes. Yeah, I think the Cascade Cube and the Turbo Cube are 2 really good examples of cubes that make bargain bin chaff that you've never thought about ever again since you saw it for like 1 commander deck 5 years ago, all of a sudden becomes the most exciting card in a pack because of this like slightly changed context. And both those cubes are only very little bit about attacking and blocking, right? They are largely about doing things much bigger and much badder than just getting into combat.
Absolutely.
One of the things that struck me about this cube we drafted last night was, like I said, there were a bunch of power level outliers in the cube, or rather I should say that the outliers were maybe further outlying the sort of mean power of the card in the cube than the most cubes we play in our play group. There were just more cards that were just really strong.
Yeah, it's the first draft. We've all been there. Right,
and I was asked by the cube curators afterwards like what feedback I had, and immediately I was kind of struck by how some of the power level outliers, I think, were in the spirit of having a cube that just has more swingy stuff going on, right? Like, I had an opponent that was able to very consistently, with the help of 2 tutors, like, tinker into Bulbous Citadel in all 3 games I played against them. And, like, that to me felt like, okay, cool, like, that's what this cube is about. It's about doing kind of broken stuff, and there's other things that are almost as broken or, on the same sort of spectrum of broken as that I could do to, like, go toe-to-toe with that. That seems fine. And then there was also, like, just Mind Twist. And I was like, yeah, Tinker and Mind Twist are both really powerful cards, but one of them is, like, this card that's a build-around. It rewards you for drafting a certain type of deck, and the reward is a little different every time, maybe. Even if the reward is Bolas the Citadel every time, Bolas the Citadel does different things based on what's on top of your deck, how much life total you have. Like, it's still a dynamic game piece, and Mind Twist with fast mana is just you cast it, and that's it, right? There's no real reward for doing it, and it just kind of turns the game into a slog every time. And so I was struck by the fact that, like, obviously, as we're talking about, it's not just raw power level that matters, right? Is Mind Twist better than Tinker in that context? I don't know. How could we measure that? If we had 100,000 drafts, we could maybe determine it. That's not really what matters. What mattered to me was, like, Tinker was fine. Let my opponent keep doing that. That seems like what this cube is about. Mind Twist doesn't seem particularly fun to me and was kind of a nightmare to play against. And I was very, very struck by that distinction.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison to bring up, especially in the context of the first draft of a cube, because one of the things you want to do when you're starting out is make sure that there are exciting cards to draft. And Tinker and Mind Twist are both exciting cards to draft. Sure. But like you said, for very different reasons. Tinker is like, all right, you really want to find specifically Bolas' Citadel. There's also other lanes you can explore, stuff like Blightsteel Colossus, whatever. And it gets you interested in building a deck. And you're going to have like this framework of powerful artifacts. And maybe like you're not even a Bolas' Citadel kind of thing. Maybe you have like a lower powered artifact kind of theme in your cube. And you're like, well, I don't know if these cards are good enough, but Tinker is really good. So I'm going to put it in for the first draft and we'll see how it plays. Like, it'll probably be too good, but it's fine because you're inviting somebody to try something. And Mind Twist is like, this card's good, put it in a deck with black mana, maybe go out of your way to generate that black mana. And it's good to have cards like that, but when you talk about generically good things that are engaging and fun, maybe the barometer should be closer to Thoughtseize.
Yeah, it's just, Mind Twist always does the same thing, more or less, right? It either discards your whole hand or it discards the best parts of your hand at random, and it's always going to be the best cards you discard at random anyway. And that same thing is just, it narrows the space of what the game can be, whereas having Tinker and these other kinds of powerful strategies in the cube can broaden that space and make whole new types of decks that didn't exist before. Mind Twist doesn't make new types of decks. You just put it in whatever decks are already there, and it's, it enhances them and makes some games, unwinnable for your opponent. So
what you're saying is we need to put Waste Knot in more cubes so that it actually does more different things. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, Waste Knot is cool. It is very cool. I have thought a lot about the nature of power level outliers in my old border cube, which is called the Neoclassical Cube, which is mostly old border. I break that in a couple of places whenever I feel like it, again, based on pure vibes. And something that I kind of realized, I started that cube by just pursuing what the kind of old school themes were that I wanted to capture in a cube, and what I kind of discovered was that there was a very consistent pattern to the types of cards I was identifying based on vibes that I wanted to include, and it was these really, really powerful, definitely, across the line if you're trying to make a flat power level cube cards, but that are all enablers, right? Tinker's a great example. Tinker is only as good as whatever you're getting with Tinker, right? If you don't have Bolas' Citadel or Portal to Phyrexia or a Blightsteel Colossus in the cube, you can, very carefully meter exactly how powerful Tinker is based on the cards you include around it. And the same goes for a card like Fast Bond or a card like Wheel of Fortune or Time Spiral or whatever. These cards that are really, they were broken, right? Like, they were design mistakes in a lot of regards. But in Cube specifically, when you have control over what those payoffs are, rather than just being in a constructed format where players are free to break them with whatever card pool they have available to, you can, really kind of control exactly how powerful they are. And I found that in my old border cube, what I really love playing with is extremely broken enablers, and then really kind of middling or mopey payoffs, right? So you get the best reanimator spells. You get to go Dark Ritual, Entomb, Reanimate, and then you get a Verdant Force, right? Which is fine. Or you get to do the Tinker thing, but you end up with a Triskelion or whatever, something that is not as crazy as the premier targets. Or honestly, even in that cube, I do actually include Bolas' Citadel because the things you can then cast off the top of your deck with Bolas' Citadel are so much more mopey. So that is kind of the texture of power level outliers in that cube, and I think it's very defining to what that cube is.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. When I have the powerful enablers, I like doing the most broken stuff after the fact. I tend to clamp down on enablers first, but that's one thing about Cube is it does ultimately come down to your preference, and that's another reason why the article on power level outliers became about finding the fun, right? Like, if you really enjoy casting Grim Monolith, if it's not casting anything like, I mean, I think like even like Inferno Titan is too much for a lot of cubes, but
Yeah.
I played a cube recently where my deck had Grim Monolith, and like the best thing I was doing was Morphling, and I wasn't beating a lot of people with that, you know? So that's fine.
Yeah, ultimately, I do think that your approach to power level outliers is largely going to determine the like texture of the cube. And one thing I feel like a lot of maybe newer cube designers don't recognize is that there are so many completely valid answers to that question of how to handle power level outliers. People are like, oh, what do I do? Like, I want a flat power level. Cube should have a flat power level. And it's like, well, no, it could be whatever you want. And I think being in a play group here in Baltimore where we have so many different kinds of cubes, like, you know, these curators I was talking about, they're working on this cube together, they felt very like free to just be like, yeah, this is the cube where we do broken stuff. And so if you're not in for broken stuff tonight, then go draft the other cube, right? There's no pressure on them to like make it a fair or balanced environment in like a competitive sense. They're just happy to like be the cube where that can thrive. And I think newer cube curators have to recognize that they get to choose what they want their cube to be. Do you want it to be a really tight competitive format where decisions about how you use specific removal spells at specific times are going to like totally shape games and it always comes down to these little tiny edges? Or do you want the kind of cube where people can draft a deck that is just kind of broken sometimes, and, you know, 1 in every 6 drafts somebody just smokes everybody because they got all the right pieces of their deck and it's just kind of like a cool moment for them and they get to like live that dream? Those are both completely valid answers to that question. And I think where you maybe get into trouble is where you're trying to curate a cube that is somehow both, and you don't have like a clear answer to how you want the most powerful cards to shape the format.
And I do think that the least approachable version of a cube that I ever designed was coming from that mindset of trying to really flatten the power band. And when you're designing the cube and you're really in the weeds, you know what kind of decks the cube is going to generate, and you kind of know what your approach is going to be. Even if you have to think when you open your pack, you still are at least looking at the possibilities. And you're like, all right, well, these cards are all kind of similar, but I like this style of deck, so I'm going to take this card because there's more options to wheel it, whatever. Like, try to identify what kind of colors you want to signal. But somebody else who's playing your cube for the first time, those power level outliers are useful, one, to drive excitement. If the cube power band is just totally flat and there's no cards that they like, then they're just looking at hill giants, you know. And I'm gonna unapologetically throw shade. Nobody's excited about hill giant in 2024.
I just watched Anthony's heart break.
Look, I'm more of a grizzly bear fan myself.
It's that scene.
I do still appreciate a grizzly bear.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an interesting tension in this sort of question about cube design, where, you know, your initial point is totally reasonable that, like, the power outliers are a problem. If somebody plays a card that just is going to take over the game consistently, that's not going to be a fun experience. But also, to take that to an extreme is also not practical. To say, let's just smooth everything out, sand off all the edges, now all the cards are the same. There aren't really interesting decisions there either. There aren't, like, pathways into drafting exciting decks. So you kind of do need to find some way to mitigate the fact that you are going to have some level of difference, of inconsistency that actually makes the games interesting.
Yeah, a cube should have some sharp corners. You know, you don't want to round everything off.
That would be a sphere.
Some friends for a while, they had a project called The Sphere that was supposed to just be the worst cards in Magic. I've never drafted The Sphere. I probably wouldn't have any fun if I did. But in addition to excitement opening packs, you were talking at the top of the show about players kind of ranking their own assessment of how good they are at the game, and, you know, maybe have your own idea of where you fit into the group. The best thing about Magic, there's two things that I think are arguably the best thing about Magic. One is that it's a rules engine, not a game. You can play it however you want. That's why we're talking about Cube. That's why we're talking about different kinds of Cube, right? Like, we get to reinvent the game for ourselves. The other thing that's arguably the best thing about Magic is that Magic is egalitarian. If I am the best Magic player in the world, you're going to have my number sometimes. And whether your perspective might be that you are entitled to brag about that, it might be that you got lucky and you don't want to talk about it, whatever. But that's an argument to put Mind Twist in the cube, right? Because you want everybody to have a chance to win. And Magic kind of, the baseline kind of allows everybody to win sometimes. But having some power level outliers is a really good way to facilitate that kind of with a heavier hand.
I'm increasingly skeptical of that, to be honest. Like, I've said that exact thing, but at the same time, the better players are also better at evaluating what the power outliers are.
You got to draft them. You got to get the weaker players to draft them.
You do have to know that the Moxen is actually a powerful thing, which totally reasonably, if you're newer to the game or you've just never played with Moxen before, it is a logical narrative to describe them as just a land that can get blown up by a gorilla. But, that's just not the case. And similar with Mind Twist, you might just say, like, well, I've played Mind Rot, and that wasn't very good and limited, so I'm not going to play this Mind Twist. So, I don't know. I'm increasingly less convinced that the power outliers benefit the less experienced players.
There's a learning curve for sure. Like, we're not talking about world champion versus somebody who's just picking up the game, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of an unreasonable gap to try to cross. A game can only be so egalitarian.
Yeah, I feel like my attitude on my chances to beat Paulo Vitor or whatever has like changed a lot over time. When I first started playing Magic, I was like, well, no, I'm like new. I would never beat one of the best players. Then I kind of adopted this mindset of like, well, Magic is a game of variance. Sometimes
he'll mulligan
Paulo Vitor
because he never draws a land.
Mana screwed or whatever. And I think honestly, my experiences like playing a bunch of matches at CubeCon and stuff, and like watching the players that have success at like big long events like that, I'm much closer to the like perspective of like, maybe I'd win 1 in every 20 games against Paulo Vitor, right? Like, it would truly be, like, the flukes, right? It's not like, I think basically, like, people talk about how, like, the best players only have a win rate of, like, 60% or whatever, but then that's always playing against all of the other best players, and if you put Paulo Vitor in your normal F&M group, I think it's going to be, I don't know, 85% win rate over 100 matches or something, like... Basically, my position has evolved a lot on exactly how much variance I think there is in Magic and how much you can come to like master that variance and how that affects your win rate over time.
I think that when it comes to limited and you have the best players in the world against somebody who's never played anything other than F&M, it's really difficult, even with the best rares, to kind of make up that gap. But these days, in constructed Magic, everybody's deck is just good. And without, like, saying anything about my relative skill level, like, I've beaten plenty of Hall of Famers. I've lost to Hall of Famers. Like, playing against a good player is not easier than playing against a bad player. But when I settle down to play a modern tournament, I'm not afraid of the name on the parry board. I don't want my opponent to cast Chalice of the Void. Like, that's the thing that I'm worried about.
Right. Yeah, and that's a perspective that anything I just don't have. We don't play any constructed, so... when I think of playing the best players in the world, it's always in the context of like some kind of draft. And yeah, there I think my chances are very slim. Like you said, maybe in constructed, just purely, the matchup might be good for you, right? Maybe this is just a bad matchup for whatever deck they've sleeved up, and maybe that gives you a better chance. But I want to come back to something you said about hill giants and them not being fun. And I do agree. I think that,
I think I said exciting.
Exciting, whatever the word choice was. And I totally agree with you, right? And something that made me realize when you said that, which I had never really identified before, is that I mentioned I have my old bordered cube, which has powerful enablers and very mopey payoffs, right? They're not as bad as Hill Giant, but compared to modern threats, they are much less exciting, much less powerful. And it's funny, people are not excited about Hill Giant, but they are excited about Shivan Dragon and Sarah Angel and, Spirit Monger or whatever. I think I'm actually, more than I realized, like trading on nostalgia value there, because I think you actually can get players that have some history with the game pretty excited about a card that was at one time very powerful as a threat and by modern standards is pretty mid. Like, a Psychotog, for example, is a card that my play group loves in that cube that I don't think can hold a candle to anything that you can do in modern Magic, but that nostalgia really helps give those otherwise unremarkable threats a little something appealing to them.
I've written about and certainly thought about issues with complexity creep in Magic, and where that becomes the loudest is, in my experience, with lapsed players. I think lapsed players are harder to reach with new cards than new players. Because, like what you're describing, like, you give them a Psychotog, they're like, hell yeah. You show them a Psychic Frog, and they're like, I'm not reading that.
The Drake meme, but with Psychotog and Psychic Frog.
And like, Psychotog, I don't think I'll ever cut it from a Spooky Cube, and it's still, like, awesome there. But there are other cards where, you know, I have friends that were playing a lot in the 2000s, and we talk about and joke about the card Terravore a lot. And my friend Michael just loves Terravore, and now and again he'll like ask, like, all right, is just Terravore in this cube? When is Terravore going to be in Modern? And
still really good in pre-modern.
Yeah, totally. I implemented a house rule where I said, all right, you can play as many Terravores as you want in any of my cubes, but you got to bring the Terravores and the sleeps for them.
Terravore's in the basic land bin, but you got to bring them.
It's not been a problem.
No one has chosen to do Terravore. You just got to put Thrumming Stone in a couple of your cubes. Then you'll have people adding 15 or 20 Terravores to a deck.
To be clear, Michael's got a stack of Terravores. It hasn't been a problem.
Another thing I think is really prescient about this article is the point about repeatable types of gameplay. The Recurring Nightmare example that Anthony referenced being a really good one. I do think a big aspect of how fun or exciting a given power outlier is what does the game look like after it resolves it. You said it, I think, very well in this article where you say, like, you know, a game with Uro or Oko often just becomes a game of that. You're no longer playing a game of Magic, you're playing a game of, you know, Oko or a game of Recurring Nightmare where this is the only thing that's happening. This is what my deck was built around last night. I had a Reanimator deck in this cube we've mentioned a couple times now with Recurring Nightmare, and a lot of my games ended with me just going back and forth between Atraxa and Ashen Rider over and over again until my opponent was completely demoralized and just scooped. And that's, you know, it wasn't honestly that fun for me. I think a player that has never done anything like that before would probably get a lot of, like, novel thrill out of that. Like, I'm doing the broken thing, like, you know, feeling that power for the first time. Having played a lot of cubes, I didn't feel particularly excited by that. I was just like, well, now I do the thing, and you're going to scoop eventually until I'll do the thing enough times that you give up.
Yeah, I was on the other side of that in a different cube, and that's how it works.
Yeah, you were in the Seal of Doom cube. I was in the Atraxa Ashen Rider cube. But that repeatability is, I think, a really easy thing to look out for if you are a newer cube designer, or if you're conscious of having power outliers kind of diminish the fun in your cube. If any of your power outliers are doing the same thing over and over again, that, I think, is very often a recipe for not a whole lot of fun.
On one or both sides of the table. Because it also diminishes the agency of the person doing it.
Right.
Like, when you're looping those boom booms with your Recurring Nightmare, your brain might start to think about, like, what if I did this instead? And, like, you might trick yourself, but you know what you're supposed to do. And that's not very fun.
That's a much better way of saying it. Like, yeah, I was not having that much fun because I was like, well, obviously I just do this now, right? Like, yes, a lot of powerful stuff is happening, but I'm not making any cool decisions. I'm not, like, using my wit or skill to, like, get ahead. I'm just simply doing this thing over and over again. I will take one moment to brag. I did win a game last night where I mulled to 5. I kept an opening land of Swamp, Entomb, Thoughtseize, Animate Dead, Expressive Iteration. There were no other lands in the hand. I had to bottom 2 other non-land cards. And then I didn't hit my second land drop until turn 7, and I still won. I played Swamp Thoughtseize and took one of their cards. I then entombed Atraxa, and then proceeded to not draw lands and do nothing else for 6 turns. And then I just drew the Swamp, animated Dead Atraxa, drew 6 cards, and then started Recurring Nightmare Atraxing Ashen Rider over and over again. And that was the whole game. And that's not
weird brag.
It's not a fun game. Like, you know, it's a brag in the sense that you never think you could win a game where you were stuck on one land for 6 or 7 turns, but it was not fun. It was like it felt like just kind of playing out the natural conclusion of this system. My opponent was just like, if you don't have any grave hate or exile removal, you have to beat me before I start doing this. And they weren't able to do that, and then I just started doing the thing.
There is an argument kind of within this story, to the extent that that game was perhaps not very good. Power level outliers do enable players to recover from stumbles.
That is true.
Which is valuable. The flatter your power band, another issue you approach is like, I mulligan to 5 and we're trading Nessian coursers and you've got more of them.
Yeah.
Power level outliers are also useful. I mean, it's kind of like less of a thing in this London mulligan world that we live in, but going down a card in limited definitely sucks more than constructed, even in a high-powered cube.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point that I've definitely experienced. So I think a lot of this really applies to my primary cube, the regular cube, which is very much like a limited set in the fact that, it's much about playing with the board and getting creatures and curving out. But the experience of designing that cube has been very much following this process that you've described, honestly, of finding those power outliers based on both, what cards seem to just most powerful, but then really focusing on that player experience of what has been kind of repetitive and just feels like it impacts the game immediately. And the cube did kind of get to a point where it's like, well, it's really hard to recover from stumbles if your opponent curves out better than you, and if you're down 2 cards because they got a 2-for-1, you're pretty far behind because a lot of the cards are just in this really narrow band. So it's kind of like something that I've been trying to explore in other cube projects is how do I, without necessarily reintroducing all the negatives that big power outliers come with, reintroduce some of that like ability for players to catch up when they fall very far behind and open a pack and find something really exciting that they want to dive into. And it's been difficult to support both of those things at the same time. Like there is a very real tension in these, just this challenge of a big power level delta.
Yeah, that's an issue that I run into with the Tempo Tubert, because a lot of the cards do trade 1-for-1. A lot of the creatures are similarly sized, and I've kind of taken steps to try to give green more stuff that's good against removal and more advantage against the other creatures. Like Lovestruck Beast was like a pretty revelatory addition for green in the cube. And one of the cards that's definitely, I think like the absolute power outlier of that cube, I like having it in the cube because it's a card that I love, and it kind of sucks in a lot of other cubes, is Treasure Cruise. Like, it's just not as good as I wish that it was. Like, it wasn't.
This is a new take I have not heard before.
Well, like in Vintage Cube, which is like typically where it shows up, it's just so much worse than a lot of different card draw. Like, you kind of just need to get going faster than that. And I don't know, if you get all the fetch lands, sure, but nobody passes fetch lands anymore. Like, it's just more work than it's worth in Vintage Cube, and it doesn't show up a lot of... Like, it's great in Pauper Cube. It remains one of the best cards in my Pauper Cube, too. But it is like the card that needed to be restricted or banned in the Tempo Tubert. And I like having that around in the sense that it's something that you can do if you fall behind. Those extra cards can help you catch up. Like, if all your creatures are dying, they're fuel for the cruise. It becomes a very negative experience, and it's kind of like what you described, where if the good player gobbles up all the good cards, then the person that's disadvantaged, they're not going to be able to win. Where, like, somebody just has, like, for whatever reason, blue, which is loudly the best color in that cube, is just underdrafted. I had a draft last year where I just had like a super good 3 or 4 color deck with I had Treasure Cruise Expressive Iteration, and I played against a Rakdos deck, and it's like, you just don't stand a chance. Like, this game's never going to be competitive. So it's useful in the catch-up space. It is harmful in the space where it does make gaps in power level more pronounced. And I don't know, it just kind of plays differently every time. That's kind of the inherent variance in the game of Magic. And it does kind of come back to that equation of how good is it when it's good, how bad is it when it's bad.
It's funny, I think what you said about Treasure Cruise there, Anthony, is just emblematic of like our sort of filter bubble, because
definitely,
like, I think that's your experience from playing with it in the Bud Magic Cube, where
there are lots of fetch lands.
Right, it's much closer, I think, to like the Tempo Tubert in terms of the cards it includes. I do have double sets of fetch lands at 360.
Okay, so double fetches makes a huge difference.
Makes a huge difference. So, like, Treasure Cruise is kind of busted there, but I have heard Ryan say the thing he said, which is that it's just not that good in Vintage Cube. Players say that a lot, because in other cubes, it's just, if you don't have the way to fill the graveyard that quickly, and you also, if you have cards like Ancestral Recall, it looks a lot worse by comparison, obviously. So, yeah, that's another card that is really, really affected by the context in which it's played, and I find that players either are not familiar with the card from Constructed, and they're like, well, this is an 8-mana draw 3, that's so much. Like, they have the reaction that, like, every player had when they read the card initially when it was spoiled. I'm not sure if you've ever done this, Ryan, but I love that you can go back to... there's a whole subreddit for supposedly self-professed spiky Magic players r/spikes, and you can go read the preview threads for cards like Treasure Cruise, and everyone was just like, bad, awful, terrible. Maybe in a self-milled deck I could see playing one or two, and just how wrong everybody was about it. But you get that take, or you get the take of like people knowing that it's banned and constructed and just thinking it's broken. Rarely do you get the nuanced take of like, actually it just matters based on context. Again, like it depends entirely on what cube you're in.
Well, you need to be right or wrong.
Exactly.
There's no room for someone to be correct if we're deferring to context.
It's so much easier just to simply have the answer and just give it instead of making people think about things.
Right. Yeah, everybody but Bob Huang missed Treasure Cruise.
Thinking about what you said earlier about trying to figure out how to make power outliers work for catching up but not for getting further ahead, I feel like this is actually a space that for all the 25 or 30,000 Magic cards we have is surprisingly underexplored. It is a very, very common pattern in Magic cards that if they are good when you are behind, they are also good when you're ahead. It is hard to design cards that fit into that other box, right? Like the obvious examples are like board wipes or something where, you know, if you don't want a board, you want your opponent to have a board, that's a really good kind of comeback card. But absent cards like that, there actually are really, really few. I remember designing a battle box. The first battle box I ever designed, I was specifically trying to avoid board wipes and like things that could get more than like a 2-for-1 basically on this individual card, and trying to find things that would help a player that was behind, because I had a lot of tempo cards in that battle box, and the fact that you're both just drawing off a random pile of cards with no ability to like have any card selection or draft just meant that the early versions of that battle box, I felt a lot of snowballing. Whoever got ahead just kind of stayed ahead. And you know, other than cards like Even the Odds, or what's the other one that like Fateful
Hour, I think, was a whole mechanic, right? Of
yeah, but there's a specific white instant that makes tokens if they have more creatures and gains life if they have more life, and like it does a bunch of things. I forget what it's called, Last Stand or something. I'm getting it wrong, but there's a couple cards like that kind of explicitly say if you are losing, this card does more than if you are winning.
Timely reinforcements.
Thank you, timely reinforcements. Pulse of the Tangle, another example, like make a 3/3, put this card back in your hand if your opponent has more creatures than you. But in the grand scheme of all of Magic, that space is really underexplored, it seems like. You know, it's just threats are good if you're ahead and they're good if you're behind. You want, I guess, a better blocking threat if you're behind. Removal's good if you're ahead, it's good if you're behind. It just all kind of works on both sides of the battlefield. So that is a space I definitely think is weirdly underexplored.
Is it underexplored or is it difficult space? I've been thinking about
probably
cards.
The latter.
Like, Balance is like the first card really in this space, right?
Yeah.
And the card that came to mind was, that used to be very good, and it's not very good by today's standards, is Knight of the White Orchid. And a big part of that is, at that point in time, a 2-mana 2/2 with First Strike was just like pretty good on rate. If you were on the play, you're like, all right, just jam this, and like try to get the land if you can manipulate it otherwise, or you're on the draw. And they've been printing more cards. They tend to show up in commander decks where it's like, if your opponent has more lands than you, tithe. If your opponent has more cards in hand than you, investigate. And the cards, they tend to not be very good on rate if they're not doing their thing. And they both don't make up for it enough in terms of catching up, which is tough because, like, that balance kind of pulls in both directions. You got to pay attention to both sides of the card when you're designing these. And then the other thing is, you mentioned Waste Not earlier in the conversation. From my perspective, when I'm curating a cube, I really like incentivizing players to build their own Rube Goldberg machine. And, you know, we talked about Tinker, it's power level outlier, but it tells you build a deck that does this. The more your card cares about what your opponent's doing, the less agency you have over the way the games are going to shape up, the less agency you have over the machine that you're building, which makes them kind of tough to approach from Cube as well, to the extent that they even exist.
Yeah, I guess we have gotten a lot of cards like that in Commander products specifically. Like you said, I think they're often not costed for one-on-one Magic, and they always read to me like Wizards just trying to basically give White some ramp or card draw because Commander players have wanted it so badly for so long, more than they feel like actually cards that are trying to like even an uneven, you know, battlefield or something. But yeah, I think you're probably right. I think it's a really difficult space to fill because the other thing is your decks are not going to be built for the most part with the expectation of playing from behind, right? You don't want to build a deck that intends to be behind, except in as much as like a control deck is kind of accepting that role, right? You're accepting that on the first 3 turns of the game, your opponent is going to do a lot more proactive stuff than you are, and you're going to have the better late game. But aside from that, if you're playing, a bunch of creatures or things like that, you just want to have more creatures in play earlier. You don't want to wait and fall behind intentionally so your card works and does what your deck was designed to do, which does make it a weird space to explore, I think.
Another card that kind of just came to mind in this conversation that I support in the Tempo Tuber is Death Shadow, which is kind of a card that asks you to find a way to get behind enough to utilize it. And there's a 2-mana one, it's Shadow of the Skyclave, I think is the card's name.
That one's actually pretty good just on a base rate.
Definitely. That one is a stronger individual card for sure, and that bears out in that cube. But then there's the question of how many of these cards can you print? How many would you play? They take more work to set up, and an opening hand with 4 Death Shadows is usually a mulligan.
Death Shadow is a really interesting one, too, because it begs the question of how much life is actually an indicator of how much you're ahead or behind. And in a lot of games of Magic, it doesn't actually really tie to that at all, right? You're able to get your life low. You're not actually behind at all. You did that intentionally just so you could, play these big dummies.
Yeah, it's a complicated game.
That's why it's fun. One of the many reasons why it's fun, I suppose. Anthony, to come back to something you said about the regular cube, you mentioned that you want to avoid the kinds of outliers that can, 3-for-1 your opponent or offer a huge reward for just casting the card, right? Have a big impact on the game without, jumping through some hoops. How do you balance that with trying to give players the ability to come back from behind instead of just letting whoever's ahead by, one resource continue to, win the 2-for-1 battle over the course of a long game? Because I've not felt that sort of snowballing, whoever is ahead stays ahead, be necessarily a problem in that cube, but how have you actually addressed that?
I think there's 2 big things I've tried to do. One is just that make sure that none of the threats are these kinds of repetitive snowballing things. So Heroic is a theme that we've talked about a fair amount. And it's not a huge theme in the cube. There's maybe 5 or 6 cards that really care about it. But what I like about it is based around sort of one-shot effect. So you have your one combat trick, maybe you have, creatures with adventure, things like that, to even mitigate the inconsistency or the risk of having combat tricks, but it's still going to be kind of a one-shot effect, and I feel like that helps both to cut down on the repetitiveness. It also means that it does give your opponent windows to actually interact with that. So if I'm casting my combat trick to come in for a huge attack, you have an opportunity to 2-for-1 me, and I think that those opportunities, I think that being mindful about where the proactive strategies are fragile has been really important to designing that environment, something that I've tried to actually make part of the way it plays.
You say you don't want repetitive threats, and yet you love Earl of Squirrel. All it do is
it's
attack
so repetitive.
and make 4
all it
squirrels
does
every
is says
time.
target opponent discards a removal spell for 6 mana.
Man, on Tuesday, I actually almost lost to Earl of Squirrel, and it happened to be your actual birthday, and I was like, if I lose to Earl of Squirrel on Anthony's birthday, this is a gift from the gods to him. But then I just simply blocked it with my Ginger Brute and sacrificed it so they didn't get to make any squirrels.
Yeah,
and I was fine.
I heard that Mortarpod also played a role in another match of just never allowing it to actually do damage, which is what Mortarpod is there for, so great.
What else about this topic? Do you feel like we covered at least your perspective on this topic thoroughly, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear from this conversation that there's a lot going on here. And thinking about a way to have a card that is specifically so strong when you're behind without enabling somebody to really get ahead and stay ahead. To the extent that there are good answers to that question, it's so contextual, to try not to bail on that point. But that is just one thing about Cube. I'm talking about some environments, you're talking about very different environments, and I feel like when I'm thinking about questions that readers have and when I'm engaging with my audience, there's always this how do you do this in Cube? And the answer is so much, it depends. And that's a difficulty when it comes to writing about these topics and why that article isn't a complete work. And that also kind of, when you were talking about, you've been doing, you thought you had so many ideas for the podcast and you've been doing it for however many years now. Part of the thing about Cube is when you do a podcast about a topic or you write about a topic, you probably need to update it next year.
We have had a couple things we've returned to very explicitly and been like, we talked about this already, and now we're coming back to it because things keep changing and evolving.
it is so rare that there's like a timeless article about cube draft in any capacity. The environments change, heuristics change with design, and even just like having not dated card examples to reference goes a long way.
Yeah, that's true.
And this is a topic that I know I'm going to have to revisit, and it's one that, I had these points of inspiration. You mentioned that these two articles are kind of companion pieces, so I had a lot of thoughts at this time, and I know there's going to be more that comes, and I know that I'm going to leave this conversation thinking about cards that specifically are useful when you're behind, but aren't embarrassing when you're not.
Yeah, not to make this the, 15th episode where Anthony and I have turned the topic into a proxy war about combat tricks, but combat tricks have to be one of the best examples of cards that are just so much better when you're ahead and awful when you're behind. Are they not?
They can still do stuff when you're behind.
Well, yeah, lots of cards can do stuff when you're behind, but you really want to be in a position where you are forcing your opponent to point their removal spell at your thing so you can fizzle it with a combat trick.
If your opponent is ahead on board and they use a combat trick and then you have instant speed removal, the presence of the combat trick allows for a moment of a catch-up.
I'm not buying that. I'll be perfectly honest. I think if you get to the place where they're ahead on board and you have mana up and are holding a removal spell, how did you get there?
When people are ahead on board, they start getting sloppy.
That is true.
A core tenet of the balance of the regular cube is you got to get sloppy when you're ahead on board.
They got black and red mana up. Doesn't matter. Cast your combat trick.
Got to start playing loose. Yeah, at that point, you just don't cast if you're ahead on board, you don't cast your combat trick just to get more damage in. You save it until you're...
Don't tell people
that. Do you have a take on combat tricks, Ryan? Just to weigh in on this subject briefly.
A take?
Yeah, do you have a bite-sized take on combat tricks?
I don't have a bite-sized one. I can give you a couple sentences, though. I enjoy what combat tricks add to a game of Magic.
I think that's enough. We got your take.
I think that Magic is at its best in environments where creatures are generally incentivized, which is not to say there can't be combo decks. I really like having Storm around, but the Tempo Tuber is very creature focused, and thinking about lining up attacks and blocks is a big part of that. And I generally think it's much better to be proactive than reactive in modern Magic, and as such, the combat tricks I tend to favor look a lot more like blossoming defense than become immense.
Why are you looking at me like he's backing up your point, Anthony? He's backing up my point.
He admitted blossoming defense is a great card.
Of course blossoming defense is strong, but it's strong because you explicitly hold it until you're going to fizzle a removal spell, not because you're just going to get in for more damage.
I'm not prepared for this much nuance.
He was looking at me so smugly, Ryan. Like, look, Ryan's saying the thing that I agree with.
I think that they are one of the easiest card types to overdo. Like, once you're interested in them, you can definitely have too much of it, but I like a little. It's a good spice.
It's funny. One thing I've been thinking, actually, is that I think maybe my least favorite balance point for them is having just, a very few sprinkled in, because then you also can't really play with the expectation you're supposed to play around them. And I've been wondering, what the sweet spot is in a cube where,
No, that's the ideal. Mana Tithe is great because there's one.
I was thinking exactly about Mana Tithe.
So you're saying you don't want to be put in a position where it's correct to play around them, because that's not fun. You just want to play your game, and if you get got by it, you get got by it. But that's just part of the
it's
course.
Consistent to if my position is I like Magic because it's egalitarian. I don't want games to come off super scripted. I do like that Reprieve plays in similar space where your white opponent is more likely to have some stack-based interaction. But if there's just Mana Tithe and they made a white mana leak, suddenly it's just there's just a lot less dynamism. It's a lot less engaging. The games become more scripted and less fun. I love Mana Tithe.
All right. Well, to each their own, I suppose. To each their own.
And I don't like Force Spike. You could probably piece that together from what I said, but Force Spike I like a lot less.
At least it's a cogent, consistent take. It's got a logic applied to it, so gotta respect it, begrudgingly.
It's more than you can reasonably ask for these days.
And just like we've said in this entire episode, you don't need a cogent, logical reasoning to apply to your cube changes. You can just make changes based on pure vibes alone. So
just need vibes.
Yeah, you do not have to be consistent in your cube additions and cuts. And I think it's very liberating just to go based on pure vibes, based on what feels right, what you enjoy playing, what your playgroup enjoys playing. I take a special note every time somebody looks completely dejected in any one of my cubes, and just what caused that and why. Trying to make good feelings overall. Ultimately, I would say we're all really trying to curate an experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to deliver those happy feelings, those good vibes, and there's an extent to which you control that, and there's an extent to which you can't. We're all just doing our best. And if we all carry that perspective, then I think that there will be more net good vibes. And that's a funny, just relating back to the previous point, it's a funny thing that happens sometimes where many years ago now, Star City Games disabled user comments on articles. Some of it is like spam robots, some of it is like harassment, but also like the average comment was just not very good or interesting. And now and again, I'll like seek out, like I'll do some self-harm and read Facebook comments on the posts of my article.
Oh, that's not a good choice.
It's a stupid thing to do. I don't know why. I wish I could stop doing it.
I mean, not to be critical, but don't do that.
And it'll be, I can't think of a specific topic offhand, but somebody will just reply like, well, it depends. And it's like, yeah, of course it depends.
Hey, if that's the most toxic Facebook comments you're getting, that's pretty darn good, I gotta say.
Well, I mean, maybe it's a reflection of how easy it is to get under my skin, but it's just like, that comment shows so little understanding of what is happening when you see an article posted, where it's like, listen, guy, I can't get up every week, go to my keyboard, write "it depends" and hit submit.
That would be a cool performance art piece, though. You write a series of articles every week that just come down to "it depends," and tackle.
If they still paid me, I'd give it a try, but it just doesn't work that way.
There's a lot of other things at play there. It's true. I find most of the comments on things like that I come across are clearly people that have not read the thing or listened to the thing.
Yeah, and I definitely have examples of that. Where I'll write about like the most fun cube cards or like some kind of rank. I did like the Sword of X and Y cycle, where like the ones I thought were best for cube. And someone's like, I would have ordered this the opposite. It's like, yeah, we all know that Sword of Body and Mind is the strongest one, but it sucks.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Horrible to play with.
Absolutely is awful in terms of play patterns. Just terrible.
Yeah, I remember the first time I did that to somebody, and they were just like, so I'm dead next turn, and I can't block that. And my removal spell doesn't work. And I'm like, that's right.
They had a blue or green removal spell?
Let's say yes.
They had unsummon.
Let's say yes.
Well, this has been great, Ryan. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about Power Level Outliers. You are welcome back whenever you want. You ever have anything that's just like keeping you up at night that you got to talk about? Consider us a platform available for your use if you ever think that something is more suited to a meandering, disorganized conversation as opposed to one of your carefully written and edited articles.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I will say that I would love to be back on again, but I'm going to challenge you to invite me back on with something you want to talk about. Because I can talk about anything, and I do talk about it. I write 52 articles a year. That's too much. It's so much where, like, I think a lot of people hold themselves to a standard. It's too much. Where it's like, if I write a bad article, it means I'm a bad writer. It's like, listen, some of my articles are bad. I'm not going to say which ones, but, like, 52 a year? Are you kidding me?
Exercise to the reader.
Yeah, read them all. Tell me which ones you think they are. We'll compare notes.
Don't invite. Okay, that's... Okay.
Only if you read them all. Only if you read them all.
You gotta read them all.
Then you're allowed to tell Ryan which ones you think are the bad ones. That's the bar you have to clear.
Those are the rules. I think that's fair.
There's a secret breadcrumb somewhere. You have to uncover what the passcode is, what the brown M&M is. That'll reveal that you've read all of them.
But that's more of a note just to like anybody that is creating content in the sphere, or even just like for cube designers, maybe you have multiple cube ideas you're working on and you have like first drafts or even concepts that don't work. It's like, yeah, some of them don't work. That's fine. We're human.
Well, I appreciate the clear call to action, and I will definitely keep that in mind and make sure to invite you back with a very specific topic in mind in the future. Where do you want to point people? Obviously, we will link to all of your Star City Games articles. Is there anything else you want people to be aware of your work at this time, or is it really just your regular what's the name of a regular article again?
Periodical?
Column. Do you call it a column?
I tend to refer to it as a column in conversation when somebody asks the painful question of what do you do?
Yeah.
And they mean for work.
So other than your regular column on Star City Games, which I think is required reading for anybody that is deep in cube design, what else do you want to point people to?
I mean, that's really it as far as... I'm not going to call it content. I'm going to call it art.
Yes. Make the art.
That's where you find my art. I mean, I'm on Twitter at Ryan Overdrive. I post a lot less than usual, but now and again I fire off a nice one. It's a very hostile environment that is disparaging even when you have the nice ones, so I don't do it too much, but you can find me there.
Yeah, Twitter's a bad place now, and has been for a while. It's a real bummer. It used to be cool. Years and years and years ago. It used to be pretty cool.
It did used to be cool. I remember firing up Twitter and finding just like the weird accounts. Like, there was a couple accounts that were like weird hybrids of philosophers and pop culture icons that just kind of meshed up quotes from each of them. That stuff was really fun. Now it's all like sex robots and targeted harassment.
Used to be a nice place to make jokes with your friends, and now it's, yeah, like you said, just various AI bots that are trying to sell you pictures of boobs. That's it. That's all it is now.
And I guess more than like reading my tweets, what I would want to encourage is like, if you're on Twitter and you got a burning question about Cube, and make it as specific a question, you know, drive the conversation forward. But feel free to aim your questions at me on Twitter. I'm usually pretty receptive, and I try to give good answers to that stuff.
Yeah, be specific. Don't do what I did, which is just say, come on and talk about whatever you want, Ryan.
Yeah.
Bad
like,
host.
These two are really pissing me off, but you'd start on the right foot.
Well, we'll make sure we do that next time when we have you on. We'll have a very specific topic, and there'll be no confusion as to what we're discussing.
Nah, sincerely, this has been a pleasure.
It's great having you. Really appreciate it, and glad we could finally make it happen. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Anthony, Ryan, and I thinking really hard about magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. And in Ryan's case, writing articles about it. Thanks again, boys.
Yeah, thanks for making art with us, Ryan.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Take it easy.
Love to collaborate on art.